Hello and welcome. India has set itself a very ambitious target of installing 175 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2022. Recently, this was revised to 450 gigawatts by 2030. In the past, India has been praised for its ambitious targets, and in the past also India's performance has been good in achieving these targets. So the path has been India has been on the right path, but in the last year or so, there has been a slowdown in the growth of renewables, and we'll talk to Tim Buckley, who's director of the IEEFA, an energy analysis institute based in Australia and the US. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you.
Last time we spoke, I think it was in September, and you were bullish about India's renewable growth story. But now you've come out with a report which says that it's not doing that well. So what has changed in this period?
We've been very bullish on the short, medium and long-term trajectory for renewable energy uptake in India. And I have to admit, as you said, that the numbers have in the last 12, 18 months come in particularly weak relative to our bullish expectations. So there have been a number of policy headwinds, there have been a number of policy contradictions, there's been an increase in uncertainty, investors are getting a little more wary of investing, and so certainly the numbers have disappointed our bullish expectations in the recent months.
Why do you think that is? Is that we've also seen reports like last year's electricity generation in India, the electricity demand in India has been lower than the previous years. So there hasn't been a growth, there's actually been a decline in demand. So is that one of the factors? Is that the key factor, or the other factors at play?
That is actually one of the factors. At the end of the day, the distribution companies, the discoms, have not had the incentive to aggressively tender out new capacity because demand growth expectations have not matched their prior expectations. So they've certainly slowed their expectations, but there have been a number of other factors. But to me, there is a silver lining in that the Indian economy in the last 12 months has been growing at a lot slower rate than was expected. Electricity demand for 2019-20, the fiscal year, is probably only going to be up 1%, whereas 2 years back we were forecasting 6% growth. So effectively, even though we've seen a slower than expected rate of growth in renewable energy installations, we've also seen a much slower than expected growth in demand for electricity. And so those two largely match and offset each other. And so to me, the long-term trajectory for the transformation of India's electricity market, the continued erosion of market share from coal-fired power generation is entirely on track because one offsets the other in the last 12 months. And much as we expect the Indian economy to pick up strongly over the medium term, we also still very much expect renewable energy installation activity to accelerate.
And you also mentioned in your report that there are some policy decisions which have been taken by state governments and also the central government, for example, the trade duties on solar, which haven't quite worked as they had intended to. Please elaborate a little on that as well.
Certainly. Prime Minister Modi has set very clear long-term trajectories. I mean, you mentioned 450 gigawatts of renewable energy is the target for 2030. On top of that, you've got maybe 70 gigawatts of hydroelectricity. So you're seeing a forecast for a dramatic shift in a very short time frame for 1 decade to transform the Indian electricity market. So that long-term clarity has then been supported by very, very strong financial numbers. The cost of renewables is now well and truly lower than thermal power. So those parameters still very much remain, but as always, the ambition is there, the implementation of that ambition has hit some roadblocks. And so what we have seen over the last 18 months has been a clear number of policy contradictions coming to the fore and undermining investor confidence, increasing the risk profile and just generally slowing things down. Now, some of those policy headwinds are being resolved, but let's go through a couple of them. I mean, the centre has the very clear ambition, but ultimately energy is a state prerogative. So what we found is that the states have their own agenda, they have their own ambitions, they have their own needs. And so when the centre government sets a policy parameter, the states haven't always been included in those discussions. And so what we're seeing is states that are very pro the long-term policy, such as Gujarat, have actually been not deliberately or willfully disrupting the centre's ambition, but saying, well, we need to be consulted, we need to actually plan it out, and we can't shoulder the burden without being incorporated in the plan ahead of plan, as opposed to being told after the event. So whether it's the policy contract forfeitures that we've seen in AP, that's certainly undermined global investor confidence, where the sanctity of contracts has been undermined by the new Chief Minister. Whether it's Gujarat saying, well, if we're going to have to shoulder the major level of investment, we need to have the grid capacity, that's a centre prerogative, we need to actually be included. So you've got the state-centre policy contradictions. They're slowly being resolved, but they have created uncertainty, and investors hate uncertainty. But we also have, even at the centre level, some policy headwinds and contradictions. One of the, probably the really key one, and in fact I've just been at a power conference in Delhi this week, and it came up very, very clearly. So the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy absolutely emphasised the priority for Make in India. Now, Prime Minister Modi has been talking the Make in India strategy for 6 years, but he also said very clearly the solar mission of India is his top priority. But now you actually find Make in India is becoming a policy contradiction. So two key policies, and at the end of the day, it's taking time to work our way through that, or for the policy framework to work its way through. But there is going to be a lot more emphasis on domestic manufacturing of solar cells, solar modules, solar inverters, the grid infrastructure.
Which might be more expensive.
It certainly will be more expensive. In my view, China has been subsidising the development of solar globally for the last 5 or 10 years by effectively dumping. So on one hand, I can totally understand the Indian government saying we need to actually have the investment and jobs in India. We want the manufacturing. But at the end of the day, when you're competing with the Chinese, it's a dangerous proposition when they've got the best technology in the world. They've got enormous scale. They've got enormous amounts of finance to drive this. And you're trying to start from scratch in India and compete with it. It's a pretty aggressive, unfair fight, if you like. So from my perspective, I would much rather build 20 or 30 gigawatts a year of very cheap solar and forfeit the upstream manufacturing opportunity. But Prime Minister Modi has made it very clear those two priorities have equal footing, and so he's willing to suffer a slightly higher cost on the solar installations if he can have local manufacturing. But I think the latest tender is actually the government announced or completed a solar manufacturing plus installation tender, and we saw in the end it was delayed for 6 or 12 months while the tenderers looked through the numbers, worked out how to actually comply with it, looked at the economics. But in the end, the government has announced 8 gigawatts of new solar installations, supporting 2 gigawatts potentially of solar manufacturing. And so it comes at a higher price, but the price is 2.8, 2.9 rupees a kilowatt hour. So it's not 2.5, it's not 2.6 or 2.7. So there is a higher price, but the reality is the wholesale price in India is 3.5, 3.6, 3.7. So you're still getting power at 30% lower than the benchmark wholesale price. So in some respects, India can have its cake and eat it too. But we need to see these policies stabilise, be clarified, and then we need policy stability, transparency, consistency for the order of magnitude of capital that we need for India to invest in their renewable transformation. You need policy stability.
Some people have also argued that the tariffs in renewables are too low for it to be competitive. And do you think that is true? That is a fair argument to be made?
I think that is right. I mean, you only have to look at the financial distress of Suzlon, Inox Wind, Resgen. You've seen three of the major manufacturers in wind turbines actually go into enormous financial distress. But when the wind tariffs dropped from 4.5 to 5 rupees down to 2.5, I mean, a 50% reduction virtually overnight. The trouble was that meant rather nice profit margins went to razor thin, or in fact negative margins. So there was a huge amount of consolidation and pressure put on the industry virtually overnight with those landmark low transactions. So I think your point is right, that those tariffs were ultimately probably too aggressive, and so but that also creates a bit of a policy problem, because a lot of the distribution companies have in their mind, well, hang on, we've seen India have wind and solar tariffs as low as 2.43, 2.44, why would we now pay 2.9? Whereas to me, you need to step back and say, well, maybe the 2.44 wasn't sustainable. 2.9 is 25% cheaper than the market average. So 2.9 is still a great outcome for India, particularly given it's 2.9 rupees a kilowatt hour locked in absolute terms for the next 25 years. So in fact, in real terms, there's a inbuilt deflationary element to those tariffs. And that means that tariff, that 2.9 in levelized cost of energy terms, is probably actually closer to 2.2, 2.3. So it's clean energy, it's zero emissions, zero water use, and a levelized cost of energy of rupees 2.2, 2.3 is, in my view, a phenomenal outcome for India. And hence why I think India can get back on trajectory, and it can deliver on that 450 gigawatt target by 2030, even as we probably would have to acknowledge the 175 gigawatt target by 2022 is probably a year and a half behind schedule.
So that is, you think that's not likely to be achieved, but by 2030 we might achieve the 450 gigawatt target?
Yes, I mean, the Ministry for New and Renewable Energy actually only yesterday talked about 450 potentially being 500 gigawatts. Now, in other words, they're thinking they might be able to overachieve by 10%. Now, there were probably 150 people in the room who are going, well, let's get 450. That would be a phenomenal outcome. We're not on track, so why up the target yet again? We don't want hollow targets, we want realistic targets, and more importantly, the consistency of the policy framework to actually allow us to achieve that target. So I think there is an element of aiming for the moon, hoping to fall on top of the tree, but at the end of the day, the economics stack up. And so we were just hearing today from a National Thermal Power Corporation executive, and his response was talking about, well, coal is going to progressively be phased out of the system.
But at the same time, we've also seen in the last year or so that India has opened up new coal mines. Last time we spoke, India had just announced FDI in coal that, as you predicted, has not really come through. But there is also some movement on the side of more coal, where
Yes.
at the same time the thermal power plants are operating at only about 50% plant load factor. So why do you think there is this push from the government to open up new coal mines? And is it needed?
Unfortunately, I'm actually going to side with the government on this one, much as people worrying about the environment and worrying about the importance of a sustainable growth platform. For India to sustainably grow its economy, India needs to reduce its reliance on imported fossil fuels. Now, imported fossil fuels, the biggest problem is oil. India imports 80% of its oil, but it also imports 20% of its thermal coal, and it imports 50% more of its gas. So at the end of the day, you've got this enormous trade deficit in India, and the faster you grow your economy, the faster the trade deficit grows, because you're relying on imported oil, LNG and coal. And so I think a key part of why Prime Minister Modi is so wedded to the renewable energy target is the need to reduce energy security risks for India. And energy security risks are all about relying on imported fuel sources. And so the beauty of wind, of solar, of hydro, and, dare I say it, domestic coal they're all domestic sources. So ultimately, if your trade links get cut, if your current account deficit blows out, if you can rely on domestic sources, domestic resources, then your energy security issues are reduced. And so I think the Indian government is very much looking at it from an energy security perspective. So we've talked about the solar ambitions of the Indian government. We've talked about making India, but one of the other objectives is about economic growth being sustainable, and that means reduced imports of fossil fuels. And a key point that Prime Minister Modi talks about is electrification. Now, a lot of people have interpreted electrification as being extension of electricity to every person in India over the foreseeable future. But the other half of electrification is about electrification of transport. Now, why is that so important? Because transport in India, like everywhere at the moment, relies on imported oil. And so if you can electrify your transport, if you can electrify your rail system, you can reduce your oil imports. Now, all of that looks great from an economic perspective. It's great from a strategic perspective. It's great from an investment and activity onshore in India perspective. But it does unfortunately mean you need more coal. So I think a key part of how I'd probably complete that statement is that you, at the moment, import 20% of India's thermal coal needs. I think the Indian government wants to crowd all of that out as much as possible and transfer. If you're going to use coal, let's at least use domestic coal.
So you think also coming back to the electricity generation point which I was making earlier, that there has been a decline last year in electricity generation and in demand.
Yes.
And the slowdown has been counted as one of the factors for the demand slowdown. Do you think there were other factors also apart from, and there has also been, like you have pointed out in the report, that there has been a dramatic decline in coal generated electricity. So are those two things related, or would the coal decline have happened regardless of the decline in demand?
Maybe 5 years ago, we forecast out to 2030, and we were talking about the growth rate in coal consumption in India slowing dramatically over the coming decade. But we were probably the most ambitious of any of the forecasts, talking about peak thermal coal use in India within the coming decade. 2019-20 will see coal use in on-grid power consumption decline. Now, that's the first decline we've seen in more than a decade in India, probably 2 decades. So that's a pretty landmark. Now, I don't think it's entirely sustainable because ultimately we do expect economic activity to pick up. But one of the factors, the number one factor has been the slowdown in the economic activity and the slowdown in energy demand growth. But the second factor that our analysis has shown is that we have seen a dramatic increase in hydroelectricity production this year. And so, in fact, the vast majority of the decline in coal has come from increased hydro production. Now, some of that's monsoonal, but our analysis shows that maybe last year was actually a poor monsoonal period, and in fact, this year is more a return to normal, and therefore the decline in coal is actually potentially sustainable in a normal monsoon year next year. So clearly the biggest factor has been the slowdown in electricity demand growth, but the second factor has been the significantly higher utilization rate in hydroelectricity this year.
And is that part of the reason why we see plant load factors at around 50%?
Yes, I mean it's an outcome of the increased hydroelectricity production, the increased renewable energy production. At the end of the day, the grid in India, like most grids, runs on a merit order effect. That means the grid operator always takes the lowest cost source of supply. And this is one of the reasons why I'm so bullish about renewables in the long term. It's a very unfair fight. Once you've built a wind farm or a solar project, if you're competing against a coal project, you will always win the fight. The merit order effect guarantees you win. You've got a zero marginal cost of production. The coal plant needs to burn coal. They need to buy coal to burn it, to generate power. They're a high marginal cost of production. And so we are seeing, as you said, coal-fired power plants on average in India running at maybe 52, 53, 54% utilisation rates. That's a decade low. And ironically, it's actually very similar to what's happening in China. China, everyone talks about the boom in coal-fired power plants in China, but what they miss out is that the average coal plant in China for the last 4 years has run at less than 50% of the time. And now we get to 2020 and India's coal plants are running at 52, 53%. Now that increases the financial stress in the whole system for thermal power generation. The banks are continuing to hurt, the non-performing loans are continuing to stack up, and that's a ongoing problem for coal-fired power and for thermal power in general.
And you also mentioned in your report you expect a slowdown in addition of transition capacity, and that's already happened last year. There has been a slowdown in added capacity. So this sort of feeds in to the slowdown in renewables, or it doesn't.
We've actually put out a separate report looking at the grid capacity expansion, and yes, over the last 12 months there has been a marked slowdown in the rate of investment in new capacity. So that to me is a concern. Now it's probably a direct reflection of, if demand is only growing at 1%, why do you need to grow the grid capacity at 6%? Now the grid capacity has been growing at 6% per annum until this year. Electricity demand had been growing at about 6% per annum, and so the two were growing hand in hand. Unfortunately, the grid operator and the government seems to have slowed the development of new grid capacity at the same time the economy is slowing. Now, short-term economics says that's a sensible outcome, but from my perspective, if you want to invest $500 billion in really low-cost, clean, zero-emissions renewable energy by 2030, you need to also invest $200 billion in grid infrastructure and grid expansion, grid modernisation. So now, at a time when the economy is slowing, the government really should be stimulating the economy by making investments today to build ahead of the need tomorrow and next year and by 2030, because there is a clear need. I mean, everyone I talk to in the energy sector, in the government, in the banks, they all talk about India's power demand has to double in the next 10, 15 years. Well, you want to stimulate the economy? Investing in grid expansion, investing in renewables are two perfect long-term strategic objectives. And so I think, unfortunately, the government at the moment has taken the foot off the accelerator. They probably need to put it back down and stimulate the economy. The grid would be a clear area of investment opportunity in my view.
So would you say that the way things are going, if the slowdown continues for another year or so, that this could hurt India's chances of achieving those renewable energy targets as well?
It does, without doubt, because ultimately if the economy stays weak, then the banking sector stays weak, the bank sector ability to fund the renewables is diminished, and global investor appetite will be diminished. So that is absolutely without doubt. But again, remember, it's not about, well, in my view, it's not about investing 450 gigawatts or 500 gigawatts or 400. It's about progressively transforming the electricity system in a sustainable way, or to make the electricity system more sustainable. And so slower growth actually allows that transition to actually happen without as much disruption. I mean, there are definitely environmental and economic back results as a result of excessive economic growth. The environment always suffers the faster you grow the economy. So a slower economic growth rate does have a silver lining. Does that mean you don't need 450 gigawatts, or you push it out a year or two? Quite possibly. Or alternatively, you actually then start retiring coal-fired power plants today. And that's where the government has talked aspirational targets of closing up to 50 gigawatts of coal plants by 2030 in the National Electricity Plan. Now, with coal plants running at an average of 52, 53%, there's never been a better time than today to in fact take offline 10 gigawatts or 20 gigawatts of end-of-life coal plants. And in fact, the industry itself is actually now suggesting that as a solution, because if you take 10, 20, 30 gigawatts of coal plants, I mean, I heard today a suggestion take 60 gigawatts of end-of-life plants. They're fully depreciated, but they're also the least efficient. They consume the most water. They release the most emissions, the most air pollution, the most NOx and SOx, they're the ones you can't retrofit with FGDs. So ultimately, closing them down would actually reduce the financial distress in the thermal power sector by pushing up the utilisation rate on the residual plants, and that would actually accelerate the transition. So maybe the government has proposed that, it's looked at that as one option. Maybe now is a very good time to actually grasp the opportunity of decade-low utilisation rates.
So that was about India's energy sector. Finally, I would like to ask you about what's happening in Australia. Like the bushfires that we've seen have been unprecedented, and despite that, the Australian government's stand on coal seems to be unflinching. And we saw that in the Madrid COP25 as well, that Australia was making a bizarre case for transferring its Kyoto credits into the Paris regime. So, what is Australia's coal addiction, and is it likely that the bushfires that we see this year is going to change anything?
The bad news is the bushfires are now entirely out as of 2 days ago, because as I was leaving Sydney to come to Delhi, we in fact got hit with flash floods. So my city, Sydney, and much of the east coast of Australia is now under flood conditions, having just had devastating, unprecedented bushfires for 2 or 3 months. We've now got flash flooding going on. I mean, talk about the 7 plagues or biblical reference there, but we're being hit with all of them. And yet our government, as you said, is just absolutely entrenched in their coal addiction. And even today, the headlines of the Australian press are all about both sides of the government and the opposition both advocating potentially for a new coal-fired power plant in Collinsville in Queensland. Now, the Premier of Queensland's voice seems to be missing. She's come out very clearly and said, we don't want a coal-fired power plant. We're moving to renewables. We're moving to low-cost, zero-emissions renewables. But the federal government's going, it doesn't matter what the Queensland government wants, we're going to give you a coal-fired power plant, we're going to subsidise it. And they've had to say that because, in fact, all of the banks in Australia have said, we won't fund your coal-fired power plant proposal, you're going to have to fund it yourself. All of the utilities have said, we're not going to own it, we're not going to provide the equity, we don't want to build any new coal-fired power plants, we want to build renewables. But the federal government keeps going, no, we want to subsidise a brand new coal-fired power plant. So ultimately it just shows, unfortunately, our government back in Australia is very much a puppet for the fossil fuel industry. And at the end of the day, maybe to put some numbers around that, Australia is the world's largest exporter of LNG this year. We're the world's largest exporter of coking coal. We're the world's second largest exporter of thermal coal. We're the world's third largest exporter of fossil fuels. For a tiny country like mine, 25 million people, our government and our economy is very exposed to fossil fuels, and unfortunately that means the incumbent industry has huge vested interests in our government. And so ultimately the federal government seems to be nothing more than a puppet for the fossil fuel industry. So unfortunately, much as the bushfires seem to have galvanised the community of Australia, our federal government's got their head firmly stuck in the coal mine and they're refusing to pull it out.
Thanks a lot, Tim. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.